I'm going to read two poems Eugene Field wrote about courtship. Courtship, of course, was what we had before hooking up or even dating. Perhaps the way young men and young women interact has changed fundamentally since the days when young men paid calls on young women and invited them on buggy rides. Then again, perhaps it hasn't. The first poem I'm going to read is titled Lover's Lane, St. Joe. It's about an actual place. Lover's Lane did not become metaphorical until after Field wrote about it. The poem joins two different points in Field's career. The first is his early manhood, when he was working as a newspaper editor in St. Joseph, Missouri. In St. Joseph, the real Lover's Lane exists to this day. You can find it on Google Maps. The other is a period of prosperity after his marriage, when Field was spending time in London pursuing his favorite hobby, book collecting. The antiquarian bookstores of London were as full of temptation for Field as the side streets of Soho were for those with less literary vices. Here's the poem. Lover's Lane, St. Joe. St. Joe, Buchanan County, is leagues and leagues away, and I sit in the gloom of this rented room and pine to be there today. Yes, with London fog around me and the bustling to and fro, I am fretting to be across the sea in Lover's Lane, St. Joe. I would have a brown-eyed maiden go driving once again, and I'd sing the song as we snailed along that I sung to that maiden then. For I purposely say, as we snailed along, for a proper horse goes slow, in those leafy aisles where Cupid smiles, in Lover's Lane, St. Joe. From her boudoir in the alders would peep a lynx-eyed thrush, and we'd hear her say in a furtive way to the noisy cricket, hush. To think that the curious creature should crane her neck to know the various things one says and sings in Lover's Lane, St. Joe. But the maples they should shield us from the gossips of the place, nor should the sun, except by pun, profane the maiden's face. And the girl should do the driving, for a fellow can't, you know, unless he's neglectful of what's quite respectful in Lover's Lane, St. Joe. Ah, sweet hours of springtime, when the heart inclines to woo, and it's deemed all right for the callow wight to do what he wants to do. But the cruel age of winter, when the way of the world says no to the hoary men who would woo again in Lover's Lane, St. Joe. In the Union Bank of London are £40 or more, which I'd like to spend ere the month shall end in an antiquarian store. But I'd give it all and gladly if for an hour or so we could feel the grace of a distant place, of Lover's Lane, St. Joe. Let us sit a while, beloved, and dream of the good old days, of the kindly shade which the maples made round the staunch but squeaky chaise. With your head upon my shoulder and my arm about you so, though exiles we shall seem to be in Lover's Lane, St. Joe. The second poem I'd like to read is called Suppose. It's also a poem about courtship, but also a poem about role reversal. The speaker, a young man whom we must imagine at one end of a parlor settee, is addressing a young woman whom we must imagine to be sitting at the other end. He is asking her to imagine what she would do in his place, and then doing what she would have done. Suppose. Suppose, my dear, that you were I, and by your side your sweetheart sate. Suppose you noticed by and by the distance twixt you were too great. Now tell me, dear, what would you do? I know. and so do you. And when so comfortably placed, suppose you only grew aware that that dear dainty little waist of hers looked very lonely there. Pray tell me, sooth, what would you do? I know, and so do you. When having done what I just did, with not a frown to check or chill, suppose her red lips seemed to bid defiance to your lordly will. Oh, tell me, sweet, what would you do? I know, and so do you. Those poems were written, of course, in another time. A courting couple then did not even park, as it was rumored that some daring couples did in my youth. They had to keep the horse and buggy moving, if only at a snail's pace. But there are a couple lessons we can learn from these poems even now. One is that a young man may feel invited, even if no word is spoken, to do something when sitting alone with a young woman. The other is even more important for our age. When it comes to courting or dating or anything of that sort, the girl should do the driving.